Games! Well, yeah, that's what we're here for. Playing games, watching games, making games. But have you ever stopped to think about what the actual makeup of a game is? How one moment leads into another, and then another, and then another, until the credits roll. If a game is well made, you won't think about that too much. Usually that only becomes a problem when you get stuck or lost in a game. So, what in the world am I rambling on about? Well, level design. There are two major directions you can take your level design in. That being levels that are designed like hallways, or designing levels that are like islands. Yeah, before you come at me in the comments, I am aware that there's lots of ways you can create levels that fall somewhere outside of these guidelines. That's why they are guidelines, not rules. Okay, now that I've made anyone who disagrees with me look stupid, let's actually explain. When looking at a hallway design-based game, I like to think of the 2D Super Mario games. You start on the left of the level, and you make your way to the right side. Simple and easy as that. While, sticking with Mario, in most of the 3D Mario games, you get dropped off in the middle of an island, and you have to find your own way to the goal. Usually these levels will also have multiple reachable goals at once, and every one of these goals has usually more than one direct way of reaching them. In Mario games, these differences are usually called course clear type games and sandbox type games, and while that's also a good way of thinking about it, it's also rather limiting. Because with this, you make the category for your whole game, and without a doubt, it's possible to combine these level design ideas to create a hallway made out of islands, or an island made out of hallways. To take my own game for instance, because I guess I'm just narcissistic like that. Each level itself is just a small room where the objective, for the most part, is to simply make your way to one of the other doors in the level. There's no wide open space for you to mess around in, and even some of these rooms, if they look more complex than just a simple hallway, they really aren't. You spawn in a location and you make your way to another location. These levels simply contain a few separate hallways that overlap each other. But there still isn't really any empty space, any space to explore and find things, at least not for the most part. But at the same time, the game as a whole is a large world with many of these connected hallways that's totally open to the player from the start right away, creating almost an island-like design on the scope of the whole game. My point is, most games can be split up into 3 different layers: levels, worlds, and the game as a whole. Each world has a few levels, and each game has a few worlds. But what about Skyrim? That doesn't really... I said most games, didn't I? Anyway, in this case, the levels are hallways, but the worlds are more like islands, and the game itself you could probably arguably call an open world. Wait, how does an open world fit into all of this? Don't ask questions you don't want answers to. On the other hand, you have Mario Odyssey, a game that drops you into these sandboxes. Well, one time it literally drops you into a sandbox and lets you play around with more or less a fully open island. Some of the power moons are still locked into hallway-like challenges, but by far not all of them. But the game itself has a very strictly linear progression. You go from this world to that world, and then you move on to the next world, and so on and so forth. A slight branching path in the middle of the game does spice that up a little bit, but by far not enough to call this any sort of non-linear progression. Now, the reason I hesitate to call my own game a real island design, even though it has many of the things that I think island design does, is a lack of empty space. Because everything is connected through these hallways like levels, from door to door, there's little to no actual empty space in between these hallways. And if we take a look at a Mario 64 level, or even a Mario Odyssey world, we'll see that there's actually a bunch of empty space that's not directly being used for any level design based reasons. No gameplay really takes place here. But the empty space isn't there to be filled with challenges. It's there to provide the player with freedom of movement. If you are here and you want to go to there, following the actual level design as if it was a hallway would be needlessly difficult, and if you decided to do that, it doesn't really matter when you decided that, because you have to follow the path anyway. Now, if there's empty space for you to explore, maybe throw in some hazards and a few enemies just to keep things exciting, suddenly it does matter when you choose to go off this path, because maybe there can be a pool of quicksand, which, yes, I know, it's cliché, but it works for this example. which prevents you from leaving the path if you make the decision too late, or maybe there's a useful item somewhere in that empty space that you can run into if you make the decision to leave that at the right place. Hell, empty space doesn't actually need to be empty to begin with. Let's take a look at Toy Story 2. Man, I feel old just looking at this footage. Anyway, in Andy's house we have this staircase to the basement, where we'll find some missions that we have to complete, goals in the island-based level design. The staircase in no real way is an obstacle to getting there, it's not hard to get up or down from, it's not involved in the missions itself. So, for all intents and purposes, it's just empty space. But it's empty space that doesn't bore the player. In making an open world or island-based game, that's the real danger, leaving too much empty room open and being boring. Or, on the other side of the spectrum, packing things too tightly to the point where it doesn't really feel like there's any open space anymore and the island-like feeling disappears. Getting that right balance can be really difficult and generally also requires a lot more work in creating the actual levels and of course the amount of assets that you need to fill a level with. Which is why I'm sticking to these hallway-like levels, while also creating a game in which you can experience a freedom and a certain amount of exploration in just a different way. So yes, to come back to my point from the beginning of this video, hallway or island level design, that's more like a shade of grey than it is a black or white thing. But as a designer, it's a good thing to be aware of these things directly and think about them. You probably don't want to end up on either side of the extremes, but what you definitely don't want is to end up exactly in the middle range. Usually that will leave you with a messy feeling level where it feels like you didn't make any decisions, and that is because, well, you didn't make any decisions. Pick one of these two as the base for each layer of your game. Then slowly look at the elements of the other side and see which ones you want to add individually, bit by bit. Do that for your levels, your worlds, and your game as a whole, and you'll have made well-informed decisions on one of the most important elements of your entire game's design. Fuck, I hope that's the case, otherwise I've just spent a bunch of time making a totally useless video, and what's even worse, I'll have wasted even more time on the actual game creation itself. So, hopefully at least some of this made sense to you. I'll see you back in another video at some point in the future. You can subscribe and stuff, you've heard it all before, but like, I just want to tell you that there's a subscribe button below here that you can click if you want to. I'd also appreciate it if you don't want to click it to still just click it, because it makes numbers go up and that does something in my simple monkey brain. So yeah, do that please. And a very big thank you to all of my Patreons, you can see them on screen right now. If you want to help out supporting the channel, there's a link down below in the description to the Patreon page. And a special thank you to Eleanor for supporting at the Cave Digger tier on Patreon.